You getting up so early in the morning, your time, and it's hard to believe that right now you're just beginning your Sunday and I'm almost finishing my Sunday. So this is a talk about why group therapy, and I just want you to know that this part is being recorded, and once you start asking questions and we interact with each other, it will be, the recording will stop. So one big reason for group therapy is where it's all started, that almost all of us have grown up in families. If we've also been in school, we've been members of clubs, sports teams, all kinds of experiences that involved groups, sometimes small groups, sometimes large groups. Psychological difficulties arise through negative interactions with significant others that lead to fixed beliefs about ourselves and others, and these beliefs often persist well beyond their use-by date. What we believe about ourselves as kids often persist into adulthood and can get in our way. We form a life view. We form a life view of ourselves, of others, and of our own needs and others' needs. So a view of ourselves may be that we are worthy, that it's legitimate to try to get our needs met. We try to reciprocate and meet other people's needs, or we may have a view of ourselves that we're not worthy. Our self-esteem is low. We may view others as predatory, as not able to meet our needs. And then if this situation, this world viewpoint becomes chronic, then this will lead to a distortion of how we interact with others and with ourselves. So how we view ourselves, how we view others, if it's past its use-by date, we will distort our interactions. So we may become avoidant of others, we may become overly dependent on others. So what better place than to work out these issues that began in group life in a safe enough environment of group therapy for these tensions and these distortions to rise again, but this time around to learn from group interactions and feedback and experiment with new kinds of responses, new ways of dealing with ourselves and others, to come up with more effective ways of relating to ourselves and each other. The group is an ideal place to do this because each of us creates those original tensions, those original interactions, and we repeat our maladaptive patterns of relating to others right there in the group. So how good is that? There we are recreating what we always do, except it's scary. So we retreat from confronting and risking alienation and rejection. That's why in the early stages of group therapy, therapists will spend a significant amount of time developing a safe enough environment. If it's too safe, then there's no risk and there's no real growth or learning. Now, there are many different kinds of group therapy, and today I'm going to focus on the experiential group. The psychoanalytic and the psychodynamic style of group, they emphasize insight, not to the neglect of emotion, but that's their stronger emphasis. In experiential groups, it is emotions that are primary. And that is the word itself. If you take the E off, you can see the word motion. And emotions come from the Latin word to move. And this is exactly what our emotions do. They may move us toward getting our needs met. They, if it's fear, may move us away from getting our needs met. So in group therapy that are of an experiential nature, core emotions are expressed and processed so that they move the group member to new responses that are more adaptable and more useful in getting those core needs met. When we become more aware, for example, that our distancing, our pushing back, are not letting people get to know us because we fear if they do, they would reject us. If we can really begin to understand through the safety of the group that it's a way of protecting ourselves from that expected rejection, of alienation, we can then move towards the person rather than away. So emotions are a signal as to what might be wrong or what we need. Choice comes. There is a true moment of choice. When we experience the signal, when we experience the emotion, it may be for recognition, sitting there in the group, for attention, for support, for a longing to be met. But what do we do in that moment when we hear that signal, when we feel that signal? Do we constrict? Do we shut down? Do we retreat? Or do we go for it? And sometimes people will explode, go into rage, which is another form of avoiding contact. They may also get scared, and they may finally and hopefully work through these to where they can move to meet the longing or the need. Some therapists define growth as being fully able to engage emotionally in any given moment, and to use these defining experiences from moment to moment to really experience and define who am I, and to choose how I will relate to others. So I'm sitting in a group as a group therapist, as a facilitator. And a member of the group, Ted, says to Sue, and incidentally, all these names are made up names, and so are the locations if I mention them. They will not be the true location. So Ted says to Sue, I'm really glad you're here. When I look over and see you and I see how you listen to me, I just feel safer. And I looked at Sue. Just a second, I've gotten a signal my battery is running low. Hold on. That was deliberate so I could pause in the most dramatic part of the story. I just made that up. The battery did. So she has a reaction. I can see sadness comes up. And it's a choice point. There's the signal, sadness. What is she going to do? Is she going to do what she usually does, which is to constrict that feeling and shut it down? But she bangs her fist on the floor and she says, no. And I said, what's up? And notice the word was up. I didn't say what's down, because feelings come up. That's how we experience them, arising, coming up. She decides not to retreat, and she says, I felt a real sadness when you said that. I don't know why, but I did. But in that moment, she becomes vulnerable, and the group really responds to her. They're interested, they're supportive, they're connected to her vulnerability. Group therapy offers an opportunity to supportively explore in a safe environment those deep wounds, those fears, those longings for connections, for recognition, acceptance, belonging, and to work through themes of abandonment, despair, loss, and fear. A group therapist in an experiential group is going to be interested in how does a person deal with their feelings? Do they shut them down? Do they turn to anger? Do they become immature, childlike? Do they restrict them? Do they reach out? What do they do? How do they do it? However, awareness of how we shut down or reach out, get our needs met or don't get our needs met, it's not enough. And it is wonderful. One of the wonderful things about group therapy is there is the capacity to experiment with new ways of making these connections, new ways of gaining acceptance, of risking, of reestablishing hope, empowerment, and security. So there is how does a person deal with their feelings or not deal with them, but also an emphasis on establishing new and more effective ways of getting our needs met in a way that creates connectivity, acceptance, and belonging. Conversely, dysfunction, as opposed to growth, dysfunction and stuckness occurs when we won't attend to our emotions, when we shut down and instead respond with stereotypical, out-of-date responses that maybe worked as a kid, but certainly don't work for us anymore. So people can get terribly stuck in their lives. So what is it? What are some of the specific factors that promote healing in groups? And the items that I'm going to present to you are well researched and well established as healing factors. Too many individuals, and particularly in today's society, rarely if ever have an experience of truly belonging anywhere as a valued member of a group or a team or a work environment, and so often even as a family. You may be aware that I do a fair amount of couple and family work, and one of the really sad things is in family work is when it emerges that somebody really feels that they are not valued in their family, they don't really belong, and it is not always the kids. I had a mother in deep, deep pain when she expressed how she did not feel like she was a valued member of her family, that she was taken for granted to do the work, to do the chores, to make sure that everybody was all right. But after that, she did not feel any significance. It was a very sad moment for her and for her family. So one of the things that groups can offer is the experience of truly belonging where you are valued. Some of you may recall, if you've done a group of mine, that very often in the near beginning, we're sitting in a circle, and I will invite people to say something about what they want from being in this group or what their hopes are or something on that order. But rather than just going around the circle, one person after the other, I just leave it to whoever wants to speak next. And so the group goes around and everybody but two people have spoken. And each of these two people look at each other and Nancy says, "It's okay, you go." And the other person goes. And Nancy then looks up, looks around, looks down again, looks back up. And I'm thinking to myself, am I going to take the risk? Because sometimes, speaking for myself, to intervene sometimes is risky. Is it too soon? Is it too much? Is it not enough? And these are split-second decisions. And I decide, and I'm not sure what I saw in Nancy and in the group, that I was going to take this risk. And I said, "Nancy, just a second. I noticed that you offered for the other person to go ahead of you, and you went last." And I said, "I have a sense that this is not unusual for you." And she looked down, and then she looked up, and she nodded her head. She said, "That's right." And without my having to ask, she said, I never felt valued in my family. I only had older siblings. And if ever I spoke, they always told me how stupid I was, how dumb I was. And my parents never protected me. So I just learned to shut up. And I learned not to say. And I learned not to expect that anybody was going to be interested in what I had to say. So I invited her to do a little experiment, to stand up in the group. And experiments are simply, do you want to try something? We don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know what it's going to be like for you to do this. But I suggested that she say something like, I'm a member of this group. I belong here too. And what I have to say is important. And I'm going to speak my truth here. And to my surprise, she didn't hesitate. She stood up and she said it. And then I said, okay, so that's the experiment. Now it's up to you. Are you willing to own this for yourself and speak this? And she said, yes, I am. And she did. And what was wonderful was the group really responded to her. People shared with her how they could connect with that, how hard it was for them also sometimes to speak and to not feel that they belonged. Another element, and it's quite obvious, is research has shown that cohesive groups are safer groups. When a group really holds together, that people value each other, they are more willing to take risks. There is a greater expression of feelings, and they will relate to each other at a deeper, and by deeper I mean more honest, more validating, and emotionally clear manner to each others. Pardon me. A third factor is the installation of hope. Many people live their lives without much hope of it ever changing or improving. One of the things that I do is, except with COVID, is I work with an organization that works with adolescents that are quite troubled. And their whole approach is to take kids on weekend camps, and the whole experience is large group format. And one person began to speak about how he had lost hope, that he came from a family where his parents were very abusive and very neglectful, abusive to each other, abusive to him. He was getting into trouble at school. He was not attending very regularly, and he was hanging out with a group of kids that mainly were smoking dope and using drugs. And he talked about how little hope he had of escaping this. And another group member, not any of the staff, another group member about his age said, you know, Jack, when I hear you tell your story, you are exactly where I was 3 months ago. I was without hope. I was using drugs more than you are. I wasn't even going to school. Now I'm off drugs, I'm going to school, and I'm even working part-time, as they say in Australia, at Macca's, McDonald's. You can do it. I did it. And he looked up and he said, were you really where I am now? And this person said, yes, worse. I got a lot of support from this outfit. You can do it. And he looked up and he said, that's the first time I've ever felt in so long that I've got a chance. Thank you so much for that. Carl Rogers, who was one of the preeminent psychotherapists and later group therapists of the 60s, said, what is most individual is most universal. And by that when we grieve over a loss, it is the most individual pain. We can't imagine anybody else experiencing this. And yet grief is universal. And one of the things that happens in groups is that people, often because of shame, do not share these kinds of events that have created shame. And in so doing, they isolate themselves. They feel like they are the only one. The relief of knowing we are not alone, that we are normal, is healing in itself. And many, many, many years ago, it's so many years ago that I'm not going to say, I was running a weekly group. This group met for, I think, 3 hours, one evening a week. And it was the kind of group that people came, most people stayed a year or two, but as one person left, the next person on the waiting list came in. And this guy who, and this is in the 70s, early 70s, this guy that came into the group held himself back, didn't say very much about himself. And, you know, people are quite supportive in the beginning, that they don't press people, they give them a chance to just observe and to feel safe enough. But time went on and he didn't say very much about himself. And finally somebody said, you know, I'm interested in you. What's your story and so on? He said, no. If you knew, you would find me disgusting and despicable. If you knew what I have done, you would find it disgusting and despicable, which made it pretty clear about how he was experiencing and thinking about himself. And as time went on and he got safer and safer, I could see he was getting ready to tell us. And I tell you, I would go home and sit on public transport, and I was trying to envision every despicable act that I could think of. That he killed his mother, chopped her up, ate her. I mean, so that I could just sit there and say, oh, okay, well. And so finally I can see this is the evening he's going to tell us. And I'm trying to look so cool, braced for this. And he goes like this. He said, all right, I'm going to tell you. Now, I'm assuming not a single one of you understood that. So the group was silent, which he, of course, assumes is the harsh judgment. Everybody is so disgusted by him, nobody's going to say a word. So finally I say, I don't think a single person in the room got that. So he takes another deep breath and he goes, Same thing happens. I said, you know, just take the risk, try it. Maybe just leave your hand away from your mouth. And while he didn't say it as clearly as I'm going to say it, we got it. He said, now you got to remember this is the 70s. He said, I like pornography. Well, there is stunned silence again. He takes that as condemnation. But I know it because later people said it. This time they're silent because they can't believe that that's the whole story. And we're waiting for the rest of the story. So is he a porn star? Has he been in something or other? We're waiting. He's getting more and more distressed. And finally I catch on. I said, is that it? And he says, yes. And people kind of go, and then, and this is what has to do with the normalizing, the universality. This other guy in the group, because I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that. I was just waiting to see what the group was going to do. And if they didn't, then I was going to have to do something. But this guy sitting across the room, he says, me too. We got to share our stuff or something like that. Well, the guy couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. It's somebody else. And as the story unfolds, he grew up with two maiden aunts, as they were called in those days. They brought him up. And their belief was that anything to do with sex or sexuality was despicable and disgusting. The same two words that he used. So he grew up with this attitude toward himself that he was disgusting and despicable. And it was through the safety of the group and then this concept of universality that people were able to share their beliefs, their experiences, and he was really able to change his attitude and belief. And it's one of the reasons that I think that sharing, it's not the only reason, that sharing is such an important aspect of groups. It helps to normalize. That could have been me when you were speaking. Another aspect in the healing that comes through group therapy is altruism. And that is that many people who come to groups have low self-esteem or devalue themselves. And they often attend a group believing that they really have nothing to offer. So another group member says, I really like what you just said. It's like you were speaking for me, and that was so helpful for me. I cannot tell you how supportive and useful that was. And so the person begins to experience that they can make a contribution to the world, that they do have something of value. This one I call learning the tough stuff. Jim came to an ongoing group for several weeks. And in the beginning, he was quite accepted. But as time went on, I could see that the group was not hostile toward him, but in some ways even worse, a growing indifference. And I was thinking, what am I going to do about this? Because I could see this was not helpful or healing. And he himself, looking quite distressed, said, it's happening here too. That's how he started. I still remember his words. It's happening here too. I know people don't like me, but I don't know what it is. And I affirmed his courage, and I asked him if he was willing to receive feedback. And Jim was the kind of guy that looked after everybody else. Jim would walk across the room as if nobody could pass the box of tissues, pick it up and carry it over and give it to the person who was tearful. And they talked about that it wasn't true that they did not like him, but that they really couldn't get a sense of him, that all they saw was this helpful guy. And they wanted to see more of him. And he talked about, in a really open and moving way, that the only time he ever felt valued in his family was when he was helpful, particularly to his mother, that she was very stressed in a difficult relationship with Jim's dad. And so he learned to be helpful. And again, he had this experience of learning that he could have value without having to give so much. And then we come to catharsis, which is the ventilation, the expression of strong and very often pent-up feelings, usually some form of grief, sadness, or anger. And it needs the acceptance of a group to be able to express this. But again, it's not enough that we can ventilate our feelings, but we also need that next step, which is to allow ourselves to receive comfort and soothing and so on. And what happened was that a woman was in the center of a circle, and she was hitting some cushions with a squash racket, but she was doing it in quite a rhythmic way, each one a little bit harder and louder than the one before. So it was kind of like this. And a woman in the circle started to literally lose all her color in her face. I mean, she went white and she started to shake and tremble. I could see she was having a severe emotional response to this. And I asked somebody in the group that I had seen that this person had connected with before to just sit next to her, not to touch her. And then when this person had finished hitting, this other woman said that with every hit, she could hear her drunken father coming up the steps, each one louder than the one before. And she knew that she would be physically abused, beaten, and she was terrified. And she got a lot of support around that. And then she said, "Give me that racket." And she said, "I hadn't realized just how angry I was." And so she got a lot of support for getting that anger out. And then, not surprisingly, she wept again. People came around her, really held her, soothed her, and supported her. And she said, "This is the first time in my life that ever I've been able to express such strong feelings and receive such permission and support and comfort after. I've never experienced anything like this." So I just want to finish my part in this by telling you what to me is among many moving accounts that people have shared in groups. This one doesn't stand out, but I think it's very useful in informing you of how powerfully healing groups can be. This was an ongoing training group that was taking place that met weekly, and they occasionally had weekend workshops where they would invite other group facilitators to run their weekend workshop. And part this was so that they could see how people other than their own trainers led experiential groups. And this woman began fairly quickly on the Saturday morning by saying that she noticed that the men in the group were not interested in her. She did not define what she meant by that, but she said, I know that you're not interested in me. And usually there's a silence when people say things like this. It comes sometimes as a surprise, and people need time to just notice their reaction. And then this one guy said to her, and I'll call her Susie, "Susie, that's not true. I have been interested in you, and every time I've tried to approach you, both in and out of this group during the breaks, you just ignore me, shut me down, shut me out. So I've stopped. I've given up." And I said to her, "So what's your experience around men?" And she got really, really sad. Head went down, and she just started to cry. And you'll understand why when I tell you this story. From the time that she was a toddler until she was 6 years old, the highlight of her day was when she would, at around 5 o'clock, hear her dad drive into their driveway. She could hear him coming up the steps, key in the door, and the door would open and she would run to him. And all these years, he was so responsive to her. They had such a strong bond. And she would always wait by that door, waiting to hear that sound. And one evening, nothing. He did not come home. And she fretted, and her mother tried to comfort her. And when she woke up, she thought he would be there. And her mother said, "No, he's not here." And she wouldn't answer her questions. The next night, the same thing happened, and little Susie just wept and wept and wept and insisted, kept saying, "Where's Daddy? Why isn't Daddy coming home? Where is he?" And her mother said to her, unbelievably, her mother said to her, "Because Daddy doesn't love you." Now, that still moves me. Can you imagine hearing this? And years went by where she had no contact. And by chance, almost, she found her father and she contacted him and he met up with her. And of course, she was angry and he was dumbfounded. And he said, "Is that what your mother told you?" And he said, "Your mother one day told me she never wanted to see me again. And that if I ever set foot in that house, she would call the police." And I thought it best, and people in emotionally distressed times or otherwise can make terrible decisions. He thought it would be easier, he said, "I thought it would be easier for you if I just never saw you, that you would be able to forget me." And I knew, and it has been so painful for me all these years. Well, when you hear this, when you've been told one story and then get this, to integrate it and so on, it took time. But it led to a deep distrust of men and establishing close relationships. Could she ever trust again that if she let somebody in, that they would not abandon her? And so she learned to keep men out. And we reenacted that scene with her father. And in a role reversal where she became her father, she even was able to expand on that. Then she had to deal with herself, the fears, the risks of letting men in. And then I said to her, "You remember this started with Fred over there saying that he was interested in you, but that you kept him at such a distance that he gave up. Are you interested?" I said. I didn't say willing. I said, "Are you interested in doing anything about this right now?" And she said, "Yeah, I'd like to go into the middle of the circle. And Fred, I'd like it if you'd come here. And I just really see what it's like to talk openly and honestly and genuinely and maybe vulnerably to just experience you being in connection with me." And we did that. And I have no idea what happened after that, because that was it for me with that group. But I like to think that something significant changed there. So groups help us to attend to our emotions, which enable us to move towards meeting our needs and relating to others in that non-stereotypical way, as you just saw when she was pushing men back and away, where we become avoidant or we are overreactive and instead move genuinely and meaningfully toward others and connect with them that satisfies their needs and our needs. And at this point, I'm going to stop the recording and we'll have about 10 minutes of questions or